been looking at this chapter 15 of Matthew's Gospel account of the life of Christ, and we've been thinking and saying about how Jesus ministered to the excluded in society, and I've called today's short message Ministering Outside the Box. So let's begin by reading the text we're going to cover today. Just 3 verses, beginning in verse 29 to verse 31, which tells us this. Jesus departed from there, skirted the Sea of Galilee, and went up on the mountain and sat down there. Then great multitudes came to him, having with them the lame, the blind, the mute, the maimed, and many others, and they laid them down at Jesus' feet, and he healed them. So the multitudes marvelled when they saw the mute speaking, the maimed made whole, the lame walking, and the blind seeing again. And they glorified the God of Israel. Now, in many ways, this is the second part of this passage that we began looking at last time. We started off yesterday in verse 21, you'll remember, and after he has done this thing where he has healed the daughter of the Gentile woman, a woman who had shown not only a great deal of insight by recognizing that Jesus was the Messiah, as mentioned in the Old Testament tradition, a tradition that she'd not grown up with, but she also showed an amazing degree of faith in his power to heal. So having done these things, Jesus then uses that situation to take it as a teachable moment, both for his disciples and the onlooking crowd. But after these events, we are told that he moves on and he skirts around the Sea of Galilee and he goes up into the nearby mountains. Even so, it seems that a great crowd followed him there. Now, the area is called Decapolis, which Mark tells us this, by the way, and it is a Gentile territory. In fact, the name means 10 cities. And these were the 10 cities whose main function was the manufacture of coins for the Roman government. But the point is, this was a holy pagan area, a pagan place, and it is this place that a great multitude of these Gentile pagan unbelievers are either waiting for him there or have followed him there. Now, from a Jewish point of view, these people, well, the Jewish leaderships had just called them dogs a few verses ago. Anyways, these supposedly outside and outcast people, they come flocking to him, and they bring with them their disabled, their blind, their deaf, the ones who couldn't speak, and people with all sorts of other problems. They're brought by the crowd, and they're laid at the feet of Jesus. Now remember, Jesus has been seen recently to be mainly teaching his disciples. There has in a sense been a sort of intensive sort of course in discipleship training going on recently. And in this situation, it tells us that he heals these people, he ministers to those people, these people who would otherwise be considered outcasts, just like the Phoenician woman who came a few verses ago. But what is important is the fact that it appears that this crowd get what's going on here. Let me remind you, in verse 31 it tells us, so the multitude marvelled when they saw the mute speaking, the maimed made whole, the lame walking again, and the blind seeing, and they glorified the God of Israel. So once again we are told that these Gentiles saw that Jesus was the Messiah, and at least at some level they accepted him. Ironically, they are accepting him as Gentiles, whilst at the same time we can remember that the Pharisees, the religious leaders of the God of Israel, are rejecting him and saying he was in fact of the devil. So this crowd got it, and they glorified the God of Israel for what he was doing amongst them. I think one of the main purposes of this story is to continue to illustrate that those who are excluded are included when it comes to the God of Israel, to the plan and purposes of God, and they're included because they have faith. But I also think there is a second aspect to the story, and it is to illustrate again that Jesus needed still to teach his own disciples, to teach them that they ought to embrace those who are perceived as excluded, and they should include them in their Christian ministry. As a matter of fact, I think I'd sum up this whole thing by saying that in the training of these 12 disciples, Jesus is teaching them, and he's teaching them by example, to minister to everyone, Gentiles as well as Jews, and by nature he is teaching us to do the same. I think I need to repeat that. I believe the sum of what is going on here in this passage, particularly when you read it and hold it in the context of the entire purpose of the Gospel of Matthew, is to show that Jesus is training these guys, and he's doing it by example, and he's saying that you and anybody who would claim to be a disciple of him should minister to everyone, not just the inner elite, not just the Jews, but the Gentiles, those on the outside. Anyone, in fact. I think this is just the beginning, the opening up, the foreshadowing of the fact of what was declared in chapter 10 when it was said that he was sent first to minister to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But by chapter 28 of this account of Matthew's, we will see him sending out his disciples into the whole world. So I think these events here represent the beginning of that transition from the message being just firstly to the Jewish people to something with a much wider worldwide perspective. This, I believe, is the beginning of that transition. Jesus is teaching the apostles that they are also to go minister to the Gentiles. But in fact, they don't quite fully get it yet. Now, by the time we get to the book of Acts, we will discover that God did in fact give Peter a special vision to get him to go and visit a guy called Cornelius and his household. So all along the way, Jesus needed to prompt and cajole, because these guys really struggled to grasp hold of what Jesus was really saying about the all-encompassing aspect of his mission and ministry. And I suppose that's not surprising when you consider just how insular community that these guys had grown up within. Eventually they did take it on board, and the gospel broke past the boundary of Judaism and went out into all the nations of the world. Anyway, at this point, I would just like to make a couple of observations. That being, I think that the point of this passage is really kind of straightforward, and that it is telling us that Jesus didn't come just for the Jews. True, he came originally, and he came first to the Jews, but that the gospel is going to go out into the whole world, the Gentile world included. Now, it's always tempting to take this passage and use it as an opportunity to preach on evangelism, and there's nothing wrong with that. When looking at a passage like this, we can definitely say we ought to be in the business of preaching the gospel to the ends of the world, in fact. And certainly beginning at Jerusalem, as we're told later, and then to the ends of the earth. And for us, I think Jerusalem means that we should begin where we live. Because where we live is our Jerusalem. It is where we are at the moment. And I believe this passage is telling us that we shouldn't just stick with this little close-knit group of friends, but break out past that, reach beyond that, and give the people the gospel of Jesus Christ. Try and bring the message of the Bible to people where they are, where they're at. Find the intersection points where the good news of Jesus, or just the teaching of the Bible, can really help and encourage people, or maybe even challenge people where they are standing at the moment. In other words, it's a position of more outreach than in drag, which seems to be a lot of focus in the church these days. And clearly, that is what is being taught here, and most importantly, it is being taught to be done by example. But it seems to me there is another lesson here, and this is the one I want to conclude with today. So while there is no doubt that part of the message here is about the preaching of the gospel to the ends of the earth, but just focus on the story for a minute, and it's obvious that this passage deals with people who felt like they were excluded from the religious life of that day. They were described as outsiders. They were Gentiles. They were dogs even, and they lived their entire life in this region called Decapolis. They're just a bunch of pagans from the standpoint of Judaism, and they are on the outside of it looking in. And yet Jesus comes along and teaches a true Judaism, a true religion, one in which the message of God's grace is for everyone, and he does this by teaching by example. This is saying and showing us that he wants to teach us to go and embrace those who are excluded, and he wants to do it by example. Go find them. Look at the list of the disadvantaged in this passage that Jesus ministers to. The disabled, the blind, the mute, and all the other ways in which people are excluded. Embrace them all, he says. Minister to them all. Go and find those who are excluded by others, by anyone, and go minister and care to them. In a separate parable, which we'll look at in more detail when we get to it, in Matthew chapter 22. Well, let me just read it to you quickly now. Matthew 22, the opening 14 verses say this. And Jesus spoke to them again by parable and said, The kingdom of heaven is like a certain king who arranged a marriage for his son. And he sent out his servants to call those who were invited to the wedding, and they were not willing to come. Again he sent out other servants, saying, Tell those who are invited, See, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fatted cattle are killed, and all things are ready. Come to the wedding. But they made light of it, and went their ways, one to his own farm, another to his business. And others seized his servants, and treated them spitefully, and killed them. But when the king heard about it, he was furious. He sent out his armies, destroyed these murderers, and burned up their city. Then he said to the servants, The wedding is ready, but those who were invited are not worthy. Therefore go into the highways and the byways, as many as you find, invite to the wedding. So these servants went out to the highways and gathered together all they found, both bad and good, and the wedding hall was filled with guests. So the parallels are clear here. In it we see Jesus tell the story of a king who puts on a banquet, and he said, Go tell the invited guests to come immediately. Now, first century Greek expert William Barclay adds some interesting background to this, in that he says in those days we need to remember they didn't have refrigeration, and they would put out an invitation and say, I'm putting on a banquet, shall we say, on Friday night, will you come? Now we would call it an RSVP today. If the banquet was on Friday night, they would invite the people on the Sabbath or the Monday night, and people would know about it and would say yes or no. And then the host would go and buy the food and prepare the food, but all that would have to be done no more than 24 hours before the banquet. When the food was all prepared and everything was ready and served out, then the servants would be sent out, in this case for Friday afternoon, and they would go into the villages that day and say, okay, the food is ready, the banquet is ready, everybody can come. Now in the parable it's important to note that the people are told that they had already previously been invited and that they had agreed to come in some measure. And this parable, it starts with them just making excuses, and the excuses are just as flimsy as they can get. Some just say they've got to go and check their farms. So some offer excuses, and some are much more hostile in their reaction to the invite. Anyway, because of the people's excuses and worse, the king says, I want my banquet house full tonight. So we've sent out the initial invitation, but now go out into the city and invite not just those that were first invited, but invite everyone to come, not just the elite of the city. So the servants come back and they say they've done that, and they say that some haven't responded to the invitation, but they say there's still room. And then Jesus makes this very famous statement in certain translations of the Bible, and he says, go into the streets and the lanes, the highways and the byways. The highways and the hedges, the streets and the lanes. Now, the streets and the lanes are referring to the city, and the highways and the byways, or the highways and the hedges, depending which translation you're reading, they're referring to those people who are outside the city. So Jesus there, in this other parable, is also teaching and saying, go out and get the excluded people. Go out to get those people who have to live outside the city. In other words, don't just go to the elite. Don't just go to the movers and the shakers. They were the first group. They were invited. but they were invited and they thumbed their nose up at the invitation, or worse. Now go out to everyone, even those outside of the city, those who are excluded, and invite them all. So what I believe that both these passages are telling us is that if we desire to be Christ-like, then we too need to be in the business of ministering to people, wherever we might find them and regardless of what they are like. We, friends, also should be in the business of ministering to those who are excluded. That has always been the mission of the church. We ought to include those amongst us who are excluded, and we ought to minister to them wherever we find them. And that's what Jesus did here, and that's what Jesus taught here, and he did it by example. Recently, I read the story of a man called John Gilbert. John Gilbert was a young man who at 5 years old was diagnosed with muscular dystrophy. Now, he had a particular aggressive variant of that disease, and upon his diagnosis he was told it would eventually destroy every muscle in his body, including his ability to breathe. In the space of little more than 10 years from diagnosis, it did indeed take his life. But during that time, he was still able to write about his experience of living with this disease and the trials and the tribulations he faced. John was diagnosed with the condition as a young teenager and died shortly after the age of 25. Before the end of his life, he needed the help of machines even to breathe. He only had enough strength to move a computer mouse with his hand, and of course that's what he did. As the years went by, from those early teenage years, John gradually lost some things, lost abilities, one year after another. One year it was the ability to run. He could no longer play sports with the other kids. Another year he was no longer even able to walk, or certainly not walk straight, so he even lost the ability to play with others. Eventually he lost the ability to speak, so that by the time he went to high school, he was really unable to participate at any meaningful level in any of the social life or the life of the school. And John began to experience the pain of exclusion. He wrote that what he called the junior high experience was the hardest area of his life, which we would today in the UK, we talk about the first 2 to 3 years of high school. And you know, it's true that for many people, those years are some of the most difficult and challenging years that we all face, so we can only imagine how much more difficult it was for this guy. What John experienced was far worse than most of us can imagine during any difficult years that we might have had at school. He wrote that certain groups of students used to like to humiliate him because of his condition. He also wrote of how he once attended a social event at school, but it was such a disaster he was too embarrassed to ever go to another. Also, he wrote about how a bully used to torture him in the school canteen and any other place where he was aware there were no supervising teachers to watch over him, to the point that he actually became afraid to go to school. No one ever seemed to stand up for him, and maybe because they were afraid for themselves to do that. But there were also other moments in John's life where he experienced great joy and great meaning. At one point, as a young teenager, he was named as the representative for everyone suffering from his type of conditions in the state of California. And one time, the local National Football League sponsored a fundraising auction and a dinner in which John was the guest of honour, and they auctioned off many valuable sporting memorabilia that night. Now, one particular item caught John's mind, and that was a basketball signed by the players of his favourite team, the Sacramento Kings. Now, John bid a little bit himself for it at the beginning, but the bidding for the basketball rose to an astonishing amount, and eventually one man named a figure so high that it shocked the room, and there was a gasp, and no one was able to match that man, and so he won the basketball. And he went to the front and he collected his prize, but instead of returning to his seat with it, he walked across the room and he placed it in the lap of our friend in his wheelchair. He handed it in between the hands of someone who would never be able to use it, never be able to dribble down a court, or ever even think of throwing it towards a hoop. John wrote, "It took me a moment to realize what exactly this man had done. I remember hearing the gasps all around the room, and then the thunderous applause that followed, and I remember seeing weepy eyes everywhere." Well, the point of that story and why it struck me is, and I'd like to say, friends, is that you too have been given a gift that you never could have got for yourself. I wonder, have you ever realized and understood that someone sacrificed a huge amount for you without giving anything in return? This passage in Matthew, when Jesus includes the excluded, it tells me that somebody noticed me. Somebody up there cares, as they say. Somebody cares about me, and somebody has acted on my behalf. When was the last time you noticed, really noticed? When was the last time you noticed that all around you there are people who are left out and excluded? I hope you're listening to what Jesus is teaching all of us who claim to be his students here, and that through it we might learn the lesson of how to really love like the Father did, to love like the Father loved us, and to love like the Son taught us, and to apply it in our daily lives and live it in an attitude of thankfulness for what God has done for us as revealed through this, his word. People do love to think about other people and put them in boxes, don't they? In some countries the boxes are quite delineated. They are called things like class or a caste system. They're very much built into the structure of the society. I know in countries like the USA and Canada we tend not to think we have such a strong caste system, but the truth of the matter is we really do, because we still divide people up into groups based on ethnicity or even earnings. In my estimation, I think every society includes people who feel left out, people who don't get chosen or don't feel they have access to all the society has to offer. We sometimes exclude other people out of things like fear or pride in our own situation, or just ignorance or a desire to feel superior. You've only got to fly in a plane to see how people are divided there. The first class people are given bigger, comfier seats, and they're served better food, and their drinks are served in glasses instead of plastic cups, and often they'll even have their very own personalised flight attendant. The rest of us, and I would include myself in this, we have to sit in second class, eating peanuts served in paper bags with plastic wrappers. The first class passengers get to have room to stretch out and even sleep, but those of us in the standard seating are usually crushed in together, usually in such a proximity that would only normally be reserved for an engaged couple. The first class passengers have flight attendants who bring them moist towels for comfort and personal hygiene, but those of us in standard class have to just sit there and stew in our own grubbiness. Once the plane is underway, the curtain is sometimes drawn as if to emphasize the separation between these two groups of people. The curtain is a reminder throughout the flight that some people, well, they're really just first class, and some of us, well, we're not first class, and we're not allowed to violate the boundary. In fact, we can't even see what's going on the other side of the curtain. I believe that curtain, in a sense, stands for the tendency deep inside all of fallen human nature. There is an attitude and a tendency, a desire to exclude other people. These acts of exclusions, I would say, divide the world into us and them. These terms simply point out that there are differences between us and rivalries that exist between groups, very ingrained differences between different groups of human beings. But this is nothing new. These differences are as old as time itself. We love to put people in boxes. In the first century, it was the Pharisees who were the very best at putting people in boxes, and they actually excluded most other people on the whole planet. The main object of their exclusion were the people they called Gentiles. So despised were the Gentiles in the eyes of the Pharisees called the Gentiles dogs. And that's not a complimentary term, as I'm going to explain to you in a minute.
When Jesus came along, he took exception to that attitude and the actions that arose out of it on the part of the Pharisees, and he taught his disciples and anybody else who would listen to approach things radically different. It's a lesson he initially taught to his 12 apostles, but it is still a lesson that we need to learn today in the Church of Jesus Christ, particularly, I feel, in the West. Now, we've been going through this Gospel of Matthew paragraph by paragraph, verse by verse, for some time now, and on a number of occasions I've pointed out that in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus has begun now to withdraw from his public ministry in Galilee, and he now seems to be concentrating on training his 12 disciples. And we've looked so far at 2 different lessons. In a sense, they've sort of been through a discipleship training camp. What is fascinating in this is that Jesus steps outside the nation of Israel in these next verses, telling us that they actually leave the area they're in and they go across to Tyre and Sidon. And then in verse 29, it tells us he comes back through Galilee and he skirts the Sea of Galilee and goes off into the mountains. Now, another passage parallel to this in the Gospel of Mark actually tells us that he went to the area called Decapolis, which was very much a Gentile pagan area, and that's reflected in the passage by the fact in verse 31 it tells us they did not glorify the God of Israel. In other words, this passage can be divided into 2 parts. In the first part, he deals with a Gentile mother who comes to him with a problem, with a situation, and asks for his help. And in the second part, he then turns and deals with the Gentile crowd, the multitude watching on. Now, I want to look at these 2 sections in this single passage because there is an enormously important spiritual lesson there. So let's begin with this Gentile mother. And she comes to him, and in verse 21 it tells us, then Jesus went out from there and departed to the region of Tyre and Sidon. So as I've said, maybe just pause again, we need to consider the geography here to appreciate what's going on. Jesus has definitely stepped outside the nation of Israel here, and he's gone to an area called Phoenicia. And 2 of the really important cities of that area are those named Tyre and Sidon. Now, what would have struck readers of this at the time who received it in the 1st century from Matthew is the significance of the fact that Jesus has left the area of the nation of Israel, which in that day, certainly among rabbis, was pretty much unthinkable. They would never do this. As a matter of fact, this is the only time that Jesus is ever seen to go outside the nation of Israel. But furthermore, it's not just that he went out the region of Israel, he goes over to a Gentile area. And the area he goes to were a group of Gentiles who were really hated by the Jews. As a matter of fact, look at the next verse. It tells us this. And behold, a woman of Canaan came from that region and cried out to him, saying, have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely demon-possessed. Now, Matthew here is taking pains to point out that this is a woman of Canaan. Now, if you know anything at all about the Bible, you'll know that in the Old Testament, the Canaanites were the arch enemies of Israel. So Jesus is going into this area, amongst this despised, hated nation of Phoenicia and Tyre and Sidon. And they are top of the list of the already worldwide despised regions of the world that the Pharisees wanted to exclude people from. In fact, you could go so far as to say they were outright enemies of Israel. Now, some have suggested that he was going to this area to try and get some rest, to try and get away from the hubbub of all the attention he was getting in Israel. But be that as it may, he leaves Israel and he gets to Phoenicia and to this region. And here we see this Gentile woman, a Canaanite woman, crying out and says, have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David, my daughter is severely demon-possessed. Now, what is deeply significant here about the statement and the way she approaches and addresses him is she calls him Lord, Son of David. Now, if you've been following me along as we've been studying together the Gospel of Matthew, you will recall that back in chapter 12, the people said, is this not the Son of David? And the religious leaders of the day, the Pharisees, had reached a decision and they said, no, what he's doing, these miracles he's doing, he's actually doing by the power of Beelzebub. So if you follow the flow of this story in the Gospel of Matthew, what we have here are the Jews, particularly the Jewish leaders, who have rejected him as the Messiah. That was clearly spelled out for it as far back as chapter 12, the point at which he started to withdraw from teaching generally in and around the synagogue. And now Matthew suddenly points out, here is this despised, hated Gentile from this other place who cries out to him and says, Lord, have mercy on me. My daughter is severely demon-possessed. I think to really appreciate this, you almost have to be a mother or one who cares very dearly for your children. It seems to me this passage oozes with the care and concern of this mother, as we shall see, and how far she'll go to try and help her children. And I suppose we can say there is nothing like the love of a parent for a child. So she has a daughter who is not just declared to be ill, but is also declared to be demon-possessed, and that's what's making her ill. And this woman will not be stopped. She will not be denied. She comes because she's heard about Jesus. She's heard he's the Messiah, and she thinks, well, if he is, he's the very one who can heal my daughter. So she pleads for mercy. Now that's understandable, but the shocking thing is what the text tells us in the next verse. But he answered not a word. And his disciples came urging him, saying, send her away, for she cries out after us. Now that doesn't really feel like the compassionate Christ we know from the Gospels, does it? The one who goes around healing everyone everywhere. Yet here comes this desperate mother, and she pleads for him to have mercy, and she recognizes who he is, and he doesn't so much as say a word or appear initially to do anything to help her. That might almost strike you as a little cruel, and immediately you might be questioning, as I did when I first approached the passage, what's going on here? Well, thankfully we don't have to speculate very long, because he gives us an explanation in verse 24, but it's a difficult and surprising one. And he answers her and said, I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Now, in order to appreciate this, you need to understand that in the Old Testament it said that he would send a Messiah to Israel, and then through Israel the message, the salvation of the world, would go to the other nations of the world, and they would indeed be blessed through that. As a matter of fact, it's so embedded in the Bible, it's contained within the Abrahamic covenant given way back in Genesis chapter 12. So God's planning all along to reveal his word first to the Jews, and then he and they would give it to the Gentiles. And that's why we have the expression in the book of Romans that literally says, to the Jew first, then also to the Greek. And what's going on here is Jesus has come to the Jews. He started inside the land, but here we have this Gentile woman who comes before him right in the beginning of his ministry and says, you're the Messiah. And he, in a sense, says, but it's not time for him to be declared in that way yet. And I suppose you could practically say, if the Gentiles started doing that, that would cause real problems to his primary ministry to first reveal himself to Israel. So at this point, he initially is just silent. Now, as you can imagine, that provokes quite a reaction in the women. But it says he answered her not a word. And the disciples actually come and urge him to send her away. Say, if she's bothering you, or she's certainly bothering us, send her away. Now, there are several ways to take this encounter without just thinking he's telling her to go. The disciples are saying just to get rid of her, and she's bothering us. But let's look at what she says next. Verses 25 to 27. What she says and what he says to her. It's fascinating. Then she came and worshipped him, saying, Lord, help me. But he answered and said, it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the little dogs. And she said, yes, Lord, yet so even little dogs eat the crumbs which fall from their master's table. That's a challenging scripture, isn't it? But notice it says initially she comes and worships him. And the word worship simply means that she prostrates herself before him, bows down and says, Lord, help me. Now he gets to address her, and what he says is, it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to little dogs. Wow, so what does that mean? Bible experts believe that the little children mentioned in this phrase are referring to the children of Israel, and the little dogs are in fact the Gentiles. Now, if you feel that's a bit of a strong way to refer to the Gentiles, but notice he doesn't say and use the same words as the Pharisee used earlier. The phrase that's translated for us little dogs is different to the phrase dogs, which were used earlier when the Pharisees were describing the Gentiles. Now, I think I need to explain, because there is an absolutely critical observation to make here. When the Pharisees called the Gentile dogs, they meant the type of dogs that were scavengers. But the term Jesus used here is the name for a family pet. Today we keep dogs as pets, but the term used elsewhere in the New Testament when it's translated dog actually refers to something which is more like a wolf, something that lived in the hills and then came down and scavenged the garbage at night. He's deliberately using a different term that is suggesting a household pet. And what he's saying is, you don't take the children's food and give it to the household pet. You feed the family first, and then it's appropriate to give the leftover to the pet. You feed the children first, and then the pets get fed. And yes, it's often the same food that the pet will get after it has been offered to the children. So Jesus is saying the same thing here that he said to his disciples earlier. I came to the Jew first, and once I've fulfilled that, in the sense, once the gospel has been offered, then he will go out unto the Gentiles. So I came to the Jew first. I came to feed the children first, and then when they're fed, the little dogs can get fed. But she comes back to him and says, and I do love this, she comes back to him and says in verse 27, yes, Lord, but even little dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table. So she comes back and says, okay, I hear what you're saying, but I'm not suggesting I'm one of your children. I'm not even asking that you give me the main course. Just let me feed off the crumbs and be satisfied. Just give me a crumb, Lord. And then Jesus' answer, we see it all rounded up and pulled together for us. And he says, O woman, great is your faith. Let it be to you as you desire. And her daughter was healed from that very hour. You can really get to appreciate this mother's love by what this lady's done. And you've got to appreciate her persistence that she just wouldn't give up. And what parent wouldn't for a child so distressed? Think about all the obstacles she had to go up against here. For one thing, I pointed out she was a Gentile. Jews didn't have any dealings with Gentiles at all, and certainly not anyone from Samaria. But secondly, also she was a woman. What a barrier that was. The rabbis would not have had anything to do with that woman. And on top of the fact, even the disciples themselves tried to get rid of her. And on top of that again, Jesus initially said to her, Sister, I've come to the house of Israel. But she would not be denied in the face of all that opposition. No, she said, I'll just take a crumb. I believe you're the Messiah. I want you to heal my daughter, and I will not be denied. She even said, I'm not going to let go and let loose of you until you grant my request. So the point of this lady is she had great perseverance, but the main thing is she had great faith. So we're going to pause in a minute and we're going to look at the rest of the passage tomorrow. But just prior to that, I'd like to point out that Jesus, remember, has been taking the disciples through a sort of discipleship course, teaching them miraculously with great teaching and by taking advantage of the situations that present themselves. And the first lesson of this, I believe, is a reminder to them that they must walk by faith as this lady did. We shall see in the rest of this passage over the next few days, we're going to see that the disciples are still not fully getting it yet. It becomes inescapable as we move through Matthew, and even though up to this point twice now he's tried to teach the disciples this, demonstrating it miraculously with the feeding of the 5,000 and the calming of the storm, and now the situation with the lady, and yet again we will see they don't quite get it. He's gone over to Tyre and Sidon, and this Gentile woman, ironically, not only gets it, but she immediately gets it and declares, I believe you're the Messiah, and I believe you can heal my daughter, and I'm not going to turn you loose until you do it. one thing that has to jump off the page for us is the fact that she has faith, and the fact that the disciples don't really have it yet. But I would also suggest that if you want to be included in God's plan, if you and I want to be included in God's blessing, then we too must have a faith like hers and persevere like she did. Just think about this scenario. Here is someone who is excluded from the Jewish point of view and the Pharisees' point of view, but she is included in God's plan, and the reason she's included is because of her faith. This lady believed absolutely that Jesus was the Messiah, but she believed beyond that and beyond just her salvation point to see that the spiritual life and the life of blessing is lived by faith as well. She not only trusted Jesus as Messiah, she came to him with a deadly ill daughter, and she wouldn't let go of him until he healed her. But I'd like to suggest there's another way we can look at the story. And perhaps the critical point for us here is this is a lady who is excluded, and the point of it all is to show us that the excluded can be included in the plan of God in Christ. God's mercy is as wide as the Word, and his mercy and his love wants to include absolutely everyone. It doesn't matter about your race, it doesn't matter about your gender, it doesn't matter about your social status. It doesn't matter who you are or how you feel. God says, my grace is free, and you come in faith and you're included. Just come. And that, I believe, is one of the points of this story. A woman of faith, a woman who is excluded, moves from being excluded to included. And we too are included if we just come in faith.